All right, it's a minute past the hour, so we'll get underway. We'll leave the door open for others to arrive in as they come, but I want to welcome everyone to this latest of our seminars in our series this year as part of the Reimagining Contemporary Ministries for a Renewing Church project here at Trinity, which has been funded by the Lilly Foundation. We're holding a regular series of seminars and workshops this year on topics connected to core themes about creative and flexible leadership, missional, ministry for the church today, welcoming people into the rich diversity of the church. And so it's my great honor and privilege today to introduce to you my very good friend and erstwhile colleague, Dr. Nicole Roccas, who has in the past taught in the Faculty of Divinity here at Trinity College. In fact, it was 3 years ago that we taught together a course on sanctification of time. And I know this quite keenly because I'm teaching that course again now. And as I said to the students the other day, I'm enjoying channeling my inner Nicole Roccas at moments in the course as we reflect on aspects of time and liturgy and so forth. But Dr. Roccas is an acclaimed now author and podcaster and a certified trauma-informed coach. And through her writing, speaking, and working with clients, she seeks to help others locate meaning from within the toughest issues of life and faith, like despondency, grief, and trauma. And she's well known as the author of a quite popular book now called Time and Despondency, Regaining the Present in Faith and Life. And she's a native of Wisconsin, but now lives in Hamilton, Ontario, with her overactive beagle, Felix, it says on her website. So I don't know if we'll be hearing from Felix during the course of the seminar, but if we do, that's what that's about. She has her PhD in history from the University of Cincinnati. And as I say, I'm honored to welcome you here today, and we look forward to hearing you about remembering all these things. So over to you.
Father Jeffrey, and thank you everybody for being here. The title of this talk is Remembering All These Things, Holding Space for Trauma in Liturgy and Life. And before we dive in, I want to start with a little bit of a question for you all. And we're going to answer this through a program that I use called Mentimeter. It's a discussion software that I use in my work, and it allows you to answer anonymously. So your responses to this question don't show your name in any way, and you can access the discussion tool just by scanning the QR code or by clicking the link in the resources sheet. Father Jeffrey, maybe you can drop that link into the chat. So you click on that link, and the question that I'm going to start with is, how do you feel in your body as we begin this talk? So it's just a quick chance to turn inward and check in. And I will start the presentation so that you can actually answer. And this will start to form a word cloud of how we're all doing at this moment in time. Tired seems to be a favorite. Hopeful, strong, calm, settled. So again, just take a moment and turn inward. It's really easy when we attend a seminar, or even myself giving a seminar like this, to attend with just our minds and our brains. We live in a culture that's very brain centered, and we tend to sort of disconnect from our body. And this is just an invitation and a chance for you to bring your whole self to this talk, body, mind, and soul, as God has created us. Even if your body is carrying stuff from your day that is hard to carry. So you get to bring your whole self to this talk. I'm going to shift back the presentation now that we've just checked in with ourselves a little bit. I I wanted to share the guiding objectives or questions that I'm interested in exploring with you today. The first is just understanding trauma. I know that Trinity does have a course on trauma in ministry. So some of you might have taken that or will yet take that. So you probably, at least some of you probably have some kind of experience learning about trauma or even dealing with trauma in your own life. But I want to just open that up a little bit nonetheless and help us understand trauma a little bit, specifically how we might think about and conceive of what trauma is from the vantage point of Christian theology. And the second sort of guiding question or objective that I have is this concept of holding space. What does it mean to hold space in the context of trauma? And how can we, as Christians, hold space for the reality of trauma in the way that we live and worship in our communities? So these are my objectives, but I would say overall, what I'm really hoping to do today is more than provide you with some sort of practical suggestions or definitions of trauma, intellectual material. I'm hoping to sort of open up our minds and our hearts with some creativity and maybe a little bit of wonder. Trauma can be a heavy topic. It can also be a really difficult to grasp topic, and I'm hoping to just awaken maybe some wonder and curiosity and awe that we can take with us beyond this seminar into further learning we may do on this topic. And before we get into this first objective of understanding trauma, I do want to start with a little bit of where I'm coming from on this topic. I think that when it comes to any sort of topic or talk or what have you, but especially trauma, it's important to understand what the speaker's experience or expertise or authority or lack thereof is. And so I want to just share what my training is, what the limitations are, and the kind of lens that I use when I'm looking at trauma. So as Father Jeffrey mentioned, that I do a lot of work right now with clients as a certified trauma-informed coach. And I began this I did my certification over the course of the year of 2021, and I began working with clients during the second half of that year. So I've only been doing this for about a year and a half at the most. But prior to that, the theme of trauma and healing has been a major theme in my life. It's taken a lot of my adult years to make sense of and recover from traumas that I've experienced over the course of my life, including all the way back in childhood and early childhood, as well as experiences I've had throughout my young adulthood. Having to do a lot of work not only to recognize trauma for what it is in my life, but also to find healing and wholeness after trauma. And then also to make sense of trauma in the context of my faith. What does it mean to believe in a God who is good and is the giver of all good things in a world, not only in a world where trauma exists, but in my life where trauma exists? How do these two things fit together? So that's been a huge pursuit over the course of my life. And in my writing, I did my PhD in history, and out of that, I kind of segued into writing and podcasting. I've always been drawn to really difficult topics. And when you write about difficult topics, people end up contacting you about difficult things that have happened to them. And so I found myself, after writing my first book, having a lot of conversations with people where they would share things or disclose things that were hard to hear. And I wasn't always sure how to respond to them. And I found myself wanting skills and professional knowledge and insight into how do I have conversations about trauma and difficult events in a way that's safe and responsible. It's so easy when it comes to trauma to do harm, even when you have good intentions. So that is one of the reasons why that I was prompted to get this certification in trauma-informed coaching, so that I could have those conversations more responsibly. And that has sort of blossomed into this whole area of my professional life of working with clients, getting to bear witness to their stories, and walk alongside them, not only in their pain, but also in their healing. It's work that's immensely meaningful for me, and I consider it a blessing and an honor. And so, as I'm talking today, I'm sort of talking to you in the capacity of a trauma survivor. I'm as somebody also who, in some professional capacity, walks alongside survivors and tries to bear witness with them to their traumas, as well as a person of Christian faith. My background is Orthodoxy, who is always trying to bring these worlds of trauma and the goodness of God together, in faith. And this phrase, remembering all these things, is a phrase that is something that guides all of this work for me. It's a phrase that comes from the liturgies most often celebrated in Eastern Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodox churches today. So you can find variants of this phrase in the historical liturgies of St. James, St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom. And I want to share a little bit about the context of this phrase before we move further in the talk, as just, like I said, kind of a seed of hope and wonder that you can take with you from today's talk. This is the part of the prayer, it's called the anaphora prayer, where this phrase comes from, remembering all these things. And this is a part of the liturgy, or the Eucharistic service in the Orthodox Church, where basically what's happening is the priest has the bread and the wine, and he's offering these up to be consecrated by the Holy Spirit and become Christ's body and blood. And before he does this, or as he's lifting these up and offering these things to God, there's a long prayer, and it culminates in these lines: remembering all those things which have come to pass for us, the cross, the tomb, the resurrection on the third day, the ascension into heaven, the sitting at the right hand of God the Father, the second and glorious coming, thine own of thine own, we offer unto thee on behalf of all and for all. And so the priest is offering the elements to God to be made holy. And I know we have people from a variety of different Christian backgrounds here, and so we may be coming from different places when it comes to the Eucharist and what the Eucharist is, and what it symbolizes and all of that. But at the very least, what I see in this moment is a model for how we ourselves are invited to offer up our lives to Christ. Just as the priest in an Orthodox church believes that he's offering up the bread and wine to be made holy, so we too in our lives are kind of always perpetually offering up the raw elements of ourselves and our lives, offering them up to God to be made holy. That's kind of an icon or model of like what the Christian life is, or boils down to. And what I love about this phrase, remembering all these things, is it's a perpetual reminder to me that the basis of this self-offering, our self-offering to Christ, is remembering. Our Christian faith is a faith that calls us to remember, not forget. And this prayer, before offering the raw elements to God for consecration, first of all, remembers all of the things that have come to pass for us and for our salvation. And it then recounts some of the saving events of Christ's life, like the cross, like the tomb. Not all of these events are pretty. Not all of them are warm and fuzzy. None of them, in fact, are warm and fuzzy. All of them sort of unbelievable and jarring in their own way. But this prayer gathers up all of these memories, and along with the bread and offers these memories to God. And so in my work with clients, in my writing, in just my interactions with other humans, I try to remember this, that even when we're confronted with things that are dark or complicate our simple notions of good and evil and who God is and what is supposed to be happening in this life, we are called to remember and bear witness instead of turning away. And we are called to offer up these things that we can't always understand to God, along with our lives, to be made holy. So I wanted to share this as kind of like the basis for any work that I do around trauma. It's also part of a book that I'm trying to write by the same title, Remembering All These Things. Although I think the working subtitle is A Liturgical Theology of Trauma from the Christian East. But anyway, all of this is kind of the basis of how I try to approach trauma in my life. That said, let's now turn to this first objective that I noted before, which is trying to understand trauma. And I want to start by putting the ball kind of in your guys' court. Once again, we're going to turn to Mentimeter, and I'm interested to see how you all would define trauma in your own words. So some of you may have taken classes about trauma or have other professional or personal experiences with trauma. Try not to give the right answer from a textbook you read. Try to define or explain trauma in your own words. Really curious to see here. A wound that changes who you are. Take some time to reflect. Maybe nothing comes to mind at first. Harmful experience that disrupts your life. Events that leave memories of hurt and pain. Something not of their or our choosing that changes someone forever. The way our body remembers traumatic or disruptive, harmful experiences. These are all very perceptive and articulate. I'll give it a few more moments here. An event that permanently changes you for the worse, or at least has long-lasting effects. Inhibiting development of healthy personal relationships. I see someone in the chat describing trauma as an occurrence or series of occurrences that affect the life and living of the one who has endured it. Yeah. So I'm not gonna comment on each of these individually or say they're right or wrong or anything like that. They all evoke something of, some thread, some facet of what we understand trauma to be. And I just think it's important to hear from one another. And I also think it's important to start from the place that we are, to start from the place that we understand trauma, whether it's right or lines up with clinical knowledge about trauma or something like that. So however you've defined trauma, I just invite you to start from that place. And I'm gonna share some more mainstream definitions or explanations of trauma with you that you can take as food for thought. I'm gonna start with one of the more well-known people who have written about the theology of trauma, and that's Shelley Rambo. And she defines trauma in various places. So this isn't a direct quote, but it's kind of a distillation of various writings that she has on trauma. But she explains trauma as the past that remains. And what she means by that is trauma is a past experience, an experience from our past that nonetheless remains with us in the present. It often remains with us in our bodies. We may find ourselves, our bodies, as Bessel van der Kolk says in his famous book title, "The Body Keeps the Score." Our nervous system kind of retains an imprint of the events, all the events in our lives that have happened to us, and sometimes gets reawakened. The past gets reawakened in our bodies or in our minds in the form of vivid memories and flashbacks. And trauma is the past that remains and is a little bit, it doesn't really respond to normal emotional law, like the laws of how emotions typically work. So a lot of like standard psychotherapy approaches to trauma or medical approaches to treating the physical symptoms of trauma reactions often don't work, because trauma is kind of its own unique beast, and the past tends to remain unless a person can get help specifically for trauma. So that's what she means by the fact that she defines trauma as the past that remains. This definition of sorts is the sort of standard working definition that I use in my work with clients, and you can find this definition in various iterations across a lot of the trauma research out there. And it reads, trauma can be thought of as any event or a series of events that a person experiences as too much, too little, too soon, or too fast to process. And by processing, we're not simply talking about the mind, or the conscious mind's ability to process what's happening. We're also talking about the nervous system, the nervous system's ability to take in information and synthesize it and store it in easily retrievable parts of the brain. So things that we experience, if you think of, let's say, hearing someone who may have some PTSD from wartime experiences, and they hear a balloon pop, their body may respond to that as though it were a gunshot. Even if a few moments later their conscious mind realizes it was just a balloon, their body has already reacted and didn't have enough time to take in all of the information and make conscious, rational sense of the fact that they're not on a battlefield. That's kind of a way to imagine some aspects of trauma. We go through things, whether in our childhood, that are too much for us to take in. And so our mind is always circling back, or our body is always circling back to try to make sense of it. And until we're able to make sense of it and integrate it into our life story, our understanding of reality, that remains unresolved, and we'll continue having flashbacks or reactions or distressing memories of what we've endured. And this is a much longer description of trauma. That's from Gabor Mate. He's one of the leading voices on trauma research and writing at the moment. And this is from his most recent book, The Myth of Normal, which I highly recommend. And interestingly, his whole message in The Myth of Normal is that for the most part, all of us have had some personal encounter with trauma, whether it's a big T trauma, like a veteran on the battlefield, or little T traumas over the course of our lives where we've had experiences that we can't quite fit in a box, we can't quite make peace with. Pretty much all of us have had some experience of trauma, and it's had an effect on our bodies. That's the message of this book. And towards the beginning of this book, he describes trauma as an inner injury a lasting rupture or split within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. It's a constellation of hardships composed of the wound itself and the residual burdens that our woundedness imposes on our bodies and souls. I talked about the nervous system and how trauma can imprint itself even on the body. The unresolved emotions they visit upon us, the coping dynamics they dictate, the tragic or melodramatic or neurotic scripts we unwittingly but inexorably live out, and, not least, the toll these take on our bodies. I'll just give a few moments to let that sink in. Reread if you need to. It's a lot to take in. If you're kind of to the point where you're wondering, well, this is a lot. How can trauma be all of these things? Or maybe you wonder sometimes, you hear the word trauma in the media or on social media, or you hear the way people talk about it, and you think, it seems like trauma's everywhere, and it seems like people are putting everything in the category of trauma. What can it possibly really mean? Or you're trying to pin down a standard definition of what trauma is and what trauma isn't. Maybe you get to a quote like this and you just feel overwhelmed or confused. There is no single standard definition of trauma. And the more we learn about trauma, and it is a hot topic right now. And part of the reason why it's a hot topic is because of technology is improving, and we're getting to see more of like how trauma affects the body, even on the cellular level, and like neurobiology. So there's like a lot of new information coming in. Plus, we've just gone through a pandemic where I shouldn't say everybody, but many people are feeling slightly traumatized, for lack of a better term, like really not sure how to make sense of the last 3 years of their lives. So it is a hot topic, but at the same time, it's not without good reason, because we are learning so much and having to assimilate a lot of research and a lot of information about trauma at the moment. But the more we learn about trauma, it gets bigger and bigger, and the impact that we see that it has on the human person is expanding and expanding. And we're starting to realize that once someone has been through a trauma experience, there's almost a sense that it leaves no part of them untouched. Trauma is not just an emotional problem or struggle. It's not something you can just talk yourself out of or change your mind about or get over. It affects us even down to the level of our cells and our neurons. And healing has to take all of this into account and work from the body and the cells up into the mind, and vice versa. Healing has to take the whole human person into account. But if you are someone who likes squares and clear definitions, I don't have one for you. Instead, I have something that is something I've been thinking about, and that is to approach trauma as mystery. Approaching trauma as mystery, and I have the M capitalized for a reason. I came from a realm of Christianity in my childhood, kind of more on the fundamentalist side of evangelicalism, where it was believed God could be comprehended. And to have true faith was to be able to comprehend everything about God, to be able to discern his will. And if one felt that there were things about God you couldn't comprehend, it might signify a lack of faith. And so I had this idea in my mind that to be a true Christian, to be a strong Christian, meant to understand God, get to the point where you can rationally understand God. And the more of life I experienced, I mentioned that I had some difficult experiences in my growing up years, and experienced forms of suffering that didn't fit the mold of what I expected the Christian life to look like. I I could no longer really comprehend God and why He allowed things. And gradually, thankfully, thank God, I began to encounter the the idea of mystery when it comes to God, and um, being able to approach God as, there are aspects of God that we know and can see and that are made visible, for example, through His Son, Jesus Christ. But God is also infinite, and evokes wonder, and there's a lot of hiddenness about God. There's a lot of things about God I don't necessarily understand, and that doesn't have to mean that I don't worship Him. But it means that He's infinitely beyond my comprehension, and yet makes Himself small through Christ and through His presence in my life, that I can take Him in small bits. And so the concept of mystery has brought a lot of life to me, to my faith. It's allowed me to worship a God I don't always understand, and trust in a God that um, I may not understand the reasons why everything happens to me in my life. And I think that trauma too is a little bit like that. We see certain visible aspects of trauma. I see trauma in visible ways, in the sense that I see my clients struggling with visible symptoms that I can see in the flesh and blood world. I can see when people are dissociating. I can see when people are panicking. But there's so much about each person's trauma that I can't see. Even when a client may tell me their story, their trauma experiences, I know and they know that none of their words fully captures what it is they went through. There's an unfathomableness there. And so I find it helpful to begin, as I approach trauma, to begin from a place of mystery, and to, instead of beginning from a place of understanding, to begin from the realization that there will be, no matter how much I understand, there will be a whole universe of pain that I will never understand. I'm reminded of there's a really good essay, I cited at the bottom of this slide, by Callistos Ware. But in that essay, he talks about an exchange between the painters Samuel Palmer to William Blake. And William Blake was an older painter, and he asked Samuel, he was trying to teach Samuel Palmer some things, and asked Samuel Palmer, like, how do you approach painting? How do you start painting? And Palmer responded by saying, with fear and trembling. And William Blake said, that will do. That's the right way to approach it. So his point was starting something like a work of art from a place of wonder, of your own smallness, and ultimately approaching art as mystery is a way to be able to step into like transcendence. And I think we have to do something similar when it comes to trauma, because we never will understand. And honestly, thank God that we'll never understand, because I think only God can bear, and did bear, the full magnitude of human suffering in this world. And we as human beings are not capable of bearing the full meaning and weight of someone else's suffering. We can only help them hold it. The church fathers often will say a God who is comprehensible is not God, meaning why worship a God who we can understand? The whole point is that God is infinite and eternal, and we aren't, and He's worthy of our worship. And then there's another quote that I wanted to share. It's not the task of Christianity to provide easy answers to every question, but to make us progressively aware of mystery. God is not so much the object of our knowledge, so much as the cause of our wonder. And I think that here, this is kind of this is what we have as Christians. This is one of the things we can bring to the table of trauma healing. We as Christians are given tools to bear mystery and bear the incomprehensible. Whether we're in churches that have maybe liturgical and sacramental worship that provide us a container for approaching the mystery of God, or even other Christian traditions that reverence scripture and find an infinitude of comfort and consolation in scripture. We all have, as Christians, we have this threshold and this way of bearing what is incomprehensible. And we can bring this to the world of trauma, because when we can learn to bear the mystery of God, we can learn to bear mystery all around us. And we can learn to listen to people's stories without needing to fully understand them or interpret them or give an answer. We can just listen and bear witness, and allow that person's story and pain to be there without having to make it go away or get rationalized away. So I wanted to just zoom in a bit on what I mean by this trauma as mystery. I have three sort of ways that I see this concept of mystery playing out when it comes to trauma. And the first is that, as I mentioned before, it's impossible to fully fathom the true depth and meaning of what happened in a trauma experience or over the course of a traumatic childhood, let's say. And that is true even for our own trauma experiences. So even myself, when I look back on things that I've gone through, I can say what happened. If those memories are accessible, I can say what happened. I can explain the who, what, where, when, why of it all. But there's a part even of my own experiences that are a little bit behind the veil, because I don't see all there is to see. I don't see all the ways that I was wounded. I sometimes experience them when I have triggers or flashbacks, but I can't always connect all the dots. There's something infinite about the things that we experience. And I certainly can't fully understand the gravity and the meaning and the immensity of something that someone else has gone through, even when they're sharing their story with me. So approaching trauma as mystery spares me and takes that pressure off of me to understand it all. And I can give myself permission to not always understand, not always know it all, and simply be willing to sit in the mystery, being willing to sit in what I don't understand, and listen and be small, and as I'm able to trust God, that God knows even when I don't. And this is important when it comes to trauma, because so much of when we listen to survivors, it's so important that we don't force our own explanations onto their experience. So, if a woman has been raped, you'll often hear in the media or social media or whatever, well, she was asking for it. She was wearing something suggestive, or she was hanging out in this particular side of town. She should have known better. And all of these are our efforts to pretend we know, and we know how to avoid things, and we know why things happen. And that's preposterous. And so to sit in mystery gives us the freedom to withhold judgment and give that to God, and simply be humble alongside one another and bear witness to each other's pain. Another way mystery works itself out with regard to trauma is we can never fathom the mystery of Christ's presence in our experiences of trauma and healing. Part of what makes our experiences of trauma seem limitless is because Christ is there with us, and there's no end to his presence. His presence is everywhere with us. And and this is not something I can assert for other people, but I can assert this for myself that when I look back on trauma experiences I've had, I don't know exactly how or why or in what way Christ is present, but there is often the strong sense that Christ is present with me or was present with me in those experiences in the most intimate way. And some of my trauma experiences have been the most intimate experiences of Christ. Um, and often this is something I can begin to accept later and wrap my mind around later, long after the experience. But we don't, it's almost like our experiences are sacraments. Somehow Christ is present with us in those experiences. And because of that, it makes these experiences, which often come into being through evil, in their own way, those experiences can be made holy, not by condoning the evil, but by learning to dwell with Christ in our memories of those experiences. There's a really beautiful little portion in the life of Saint Macrina. This was an early martyr. Not everybody may be familiar with her story, but her brother Saint Gregory of Nyssa wrote about her life, and he was there when she died at a monastery, and he was helping a sister prepare her body for the funeral. They were washing her body and stuff. And the sister sort of pointed to like a scar on Macrina's breast and said, like, as they were washing the body, like, pay attention to that. And Gregory was like, what, why, what's going on here? And the sister explained that, because this was a taboo part of the body, obviously it still is. But the sister explained that she had had a tumor on her breast during her life. She had been very sick. And it's not how she died, but it was probably some kind of cancer or whatever. And she went to a doctor for it, and I believe the doctor wasn't really able to help. And eventually Saint Macrina asked her mother to make the sign of the cross and pray for her. And immediately when she did that, the tumor was healed and went away. But in its place, because it had stretched the skin out and caused the skin to break open, there was this scar. And that scar remained, the sister explained, to always help Macrina remember how God was present with her in her suffering and in the prayer that healed her. And the sister tells Saint Gregory, don't let this miracle pass by, the miracle of this scar. So she really asks him, like, look at this scar and remember it as a sign of God's presence. And I kind of think of that with regard to our memories sometimes, where we so easily gloss over painful memories. And sometimes we need to learn that it's okay to not let the miracle of them, of Christ's presence in them, to pass by. And the third way that trauma as mystery kind of works itself out is that we never really can fully grasp the extent of trauma's effects or imprint. This is often referred to as the imprint of trauma on us and our shared humanity. There's, when we start learning about trauma and how it affects us, like I said, all the way down, even into our cells, the way our cells function after trauma, there's almost this sense of like getting to peer behind the veil of what it means to be human, and how we are these very fragile creatures, fragile creatures. Our existence, our breath depends on God. And when we are exposed to evil, when we're exposed to sin and harm, it affects us all the way down. And we're getting fMRI machines, we're getting all this research to learn more and more about how trauma can affect us. And that's all very valid and important, but we're never going to fully get to the bottom of it. And we're never going to fully have words. When you think of, I did my PhD in history, and when you just think of the traumas that have happened throughout history and the ways those can affect us, there's more and more evidence that trauma affects genetics and epigenetics and generational trauma. Um, you just wonder, wow, like our whole world, in a sense, has been molded by trauma. Our whole historical development as human beings has been molded and affected by trauma. And we'll never be able to know what the world would have been like without that. It's like asking what the world would have been like if Adam and Eve had never sinned. This is not something we'll ever be able to fully comprehend or get to the bottom of. And so all of these things, we can embrace mystery, we can understand, we can try to step into trauma as mystery with Christ, and sort of allow ourselves the freedom to just to be and not have to understand every last thing or detail about trauma. And it reminds me of one of the core principles, this whole idea of mystery. It's kind of my own take on trauma, but it reminds me of one of the first steps of providing trauma-informed care. So you can get training in the trauma-informed approach, and I wish everybody could. I think the trauma-informed approach is something that is really helpful in any professional capacity, even like for bank tellers and such, because we all eventually interact with somebody who's really dealing with something, and it's just a helpful toolbox to have. These are the 6 principles of the trauma-informed approach. I'm not going to get into all of them. It would take a lot longer than an hour-long talk to give a crash course in the trauma-informed approach and really do it justice. But when you get trauma-informed training, before you even get to these principles, you learn to start from the standpoint that everybody you interact with could be carrying trauma, even if it's unseen. So when you're practicing the trauma-informed approach, you don't start practicing it once the person discloses to you that they've just been abused or raped or something. You approach everybody as though they are carrying something, even if they perhaps aren't, and even if you never really find out what that something is. You treat others in a way that they may be carrying something. And I think that that's such a good principle, and one that is really conversant with Christian understandings of loving our neighbor. We do not get to see always what's hidden about people. Trauma can be concealed, and yet we can love our neighbor in a way that that honors that without knowing all the details. So the part of this title referred to holding space for trauma in life and liturgy. And I want to talk a little bit about this phrase. This is my attempt at a little bit of practicality, giving you guys some practical things to leave with. But first of all, I want to explore this phrase, holding space, because it seems to be a little bit of a trigger word for some people, depending on your frame of reference. I wasn't aware of this before giving the first time I ever gave a talk on trauma and holding space, that for some people, apparently holding space is a negative thing, or they think it's like a liberal agenda, or some kind of, I don't know, shibboleth, or like new age. I don't know. Holding space is none of those things. It's just a principle that you apply when you're approaching or working with, or potentially working with people who carry trauma. And the example I give is if you encounter somebody who was hit by a car and is bleeding on the side of the road, what's one of the first things that first responders will do? I mean, obviously, yes, they're going to try and provide life-saving resuscitation if that's needed, but another set of the professionals are going to hold space. They're going to make sure the crowds stay far enough away. They're going to make sure that the person bleeding on the side of the road is safe from any debris that may come off of cars on the highway. They're going to cover them up with a blanket. They're going to do everything they can to give that person space to breathe and space from any further physical danger. And that may even mean moving the person further off the highway or wherever it is. When it comes to trauma, a trauma, even if it happened years and years ago, we still hold space for that person if they have not fully healed. And who of us have been fully healed of anything in this life? We're all works in progress, and we can all hold space for each other. But this holding space phrase is really rich, and it's really deep in terms of it almost becomes like a practice in life. But I have 5 things that we can all hold space for in our lives. We can hold space for these things for ourselves or for others in our lives, in the way that we worship, and the way that we talk about our faith or talk about Christ to others. And I'm going to give these to you, and you get to do the job of being creative and asking yourself, how would this work for me in my life or in my ministry or whatever context you're in? So first of all, we can hold space for what is unseen. We can hold off the voices and all of that, the pressure to always be explaining and thinking that we see and know everything. We can hold space in silence and humility for what we know we don't see. We know in the New Testament that what we see is not all there is. It's not even a fraction of all there is. And so we can hold space for what is unseen. And that may include the unseen wounds of our neighbor, the person sitting next to us in the church pew, our colleagues, the people who irritate us. Maybe they're carrying something we don't see, and that could have implications for how we love them and pray for them and all of that. We can hold space for humility. So in the way we construct our communities, in the way we explain spiritual virtues, we can hold space for our own need to be humble and admit we don't always have all the answers, and God doesn't expect each of us to have all the answers. We're looking to Him for the answers, and we're perpetually looking for Him for wisdom on how to love one another and how to love ourselves as our neighbor. We can hold space for God-given freedom. God gives each of us free will, but free will can be eroded. That's one of the things that often happens in trauma is we lose connection with a sense of freedom, a sense of choice. And we have to work hard to recover our God-given free will. And we can also, in recovering our free will, we can live and act in ways that invite others to recover and exercise their God-given free will. We can give ourselves and one another freedom to choose our own path through trauma. I have 3 kind of specialties in my when I see clients. There's sort of 3 areas that I generally work with clients on. The first is just general trauma recovery. The second is I work with creatives, like writers and artists. I do trauma-informed creative coaching or writing coaching. But the third area is working with clients who've suffered spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma. So basically, they've experienced trauma in a church context or from a spiritual authority. And I actually see a fair amount of clients. I've seen clients who've come out of cults. I've seen clients who've experienced spiritual abuse even in my own tradition, the Orthodox tradition. And one of the things that I have to constantly remind myself of when I'm working with them is I don't get to choose where they end up. The best thing that I can do for them is help them regain their freedom to choose. Maybe they do not end up going back to church, but that becomes their choice. And I firmly believe that a no, like there's the verse in the New Testament, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Watching people, recover their ability to say no is such a powerful thing. And I believe that God, that affirmly stated no to God, he can do infinitely more with that over the course of our lives than like a half-hearted people pleasing. Yes, I'll go back to church, even though it traumatizes me, even though I'm afraid of my priest, even though I feel like I'm dying inside every time I step inside of church. I'll go back just to like make God happy or whoever else happy. So holding space for people's freedom, even if they do things with that freedom that we don't like, it doesn't mean we don't, we don't set boundaries sometimes. It doesn't mean that people don't face consequences for doing things with their freedom that is damaging to others. But we need to, particularly for survivors, have communities where freedom is able to be exercised. And that's the only way people will ever be able to come to Christ or come back to Christ and come back to church in an honest and authentic way. People, we can hold space also, this is the fourth point, for the possibility of suffering. In the way we talk about our stories, in the way we imagine faith, in passing comments we make about news stories or gossip or whatever it is, we can and should hold space for the possibility of suffering, the possibility that maybe people who are listening to us are suffering with the very kinds of ailments or things that we may be talking about or dismissing. I read, I believe this was Diane Longberg's book, Suffering in the Heart of God. Diane Longberg is a Christian psychologist, and she's one of the leading Christian voices out there right now talking about trauma and abuse within churches in the States. And she makes one of the points, we don't think about preventative measures for preventing trauma in the church. We can't always necessarily perfectly prevent trauma, but we can create spaces where trauma is less likely to occur and where the effects of trauma are easier to resolve and heal. And one of the ways that she thinks we do that, one of the things she thinks is important, is telling stories and exploring, like when we look at the salvation story through the Bible, holding space within that story for times when suffering is the reality and not the kind of suffering that's glamorous or there's easy answers to. But there, when you read the Bible, there is real darkness and it doesn't get resolved right away. But when we approach life with a faith story that has room enough, not only for the joy of the resurrection, but for the darkness and incredulity of the cross, then when we ourselves experience things that are off the beaten path, that come out of nowhere, that make us doubt everything, we already have something in our vocabulary to grab onto and say, oh yeah, this is a part of life too. And again, not to dismiss or condone evil, but we have something to grab hold of and make sense of it with and plug our new story into. So we can hold space for the possibility of suffering. And finally, we can hold space for witness bearing. The Greek word for being a witness is martyria, or I think it's martyris or something. I believe martyria is plural, but in any case, our word for martyr comes from the Greek word, and it means witness. We often think of martyrs as the people who died for their faith. But really, it wasn't about dying for their faith. They died because they bore witness to Christ in contexts where that was maybe against the law, or people didn't like that so much, so they they were killed or had to experience like really heinous persecution for bearing witness. And we are all called to be martyrs. And whether or not we die for our faith, we're all called to be witnesses of Christ. And when I think of my own life journey and the encounters I have with people around me and my neighbors, I see that part of what it means to be a witness to Christ is to bear witness to suffering, because we encounter Christ in suffering and from within suffering. And so instead of trying to explain away suffering or try to create this narrative where once you're a Christian, everything is fine and there's nothing painful anymore, to simply see and witness suffering and whatever the consequences are of being a witness and an advocate in the presence of suffering. So those are some ideas, and like I said, I leave it to you to make some creative connections with your life. Starting to wind down, I'm right at the end of my talk, and we're gonna have some question and discussion time in a moment. But before that, I like to end my talks this way. This is one way that I invite you to exercise freedom, your own freedom. I invite you to name. You can name it just within yourself and be aware of it within yourself, or you can share it on Mentimeter. But basically, what is one thing that you choose to take with you from today's talk? And so you can share that on Mentimeter. And the other flip side to this, we're not going to share this. You can just hold this truth within yourself. What is one thing you choose not to take with you? Maybe there's a point that didn't resonate with you, didn't land with you, something you disagreed with, something that made no sense. I just invite you inside of yourself to also choose one thing you don't want to take with you, and just allow yourself that God-given freedom to make that choice. But let's share one thing that we do take with us. So approach everyone we meet with the understanding that they may be experiencing or carrying trauma. Someone appreciated the resources in the resource sheet, the different ways we can hold space for others. Knowledge of the complexity of trauma, mystery in trauma. So whatever it is that you choose to take with you, feel free to hold that with you. And maybe, Father Jeffrey, we can turn it over to questions. I do have if you want to ask your question anonymously in Mentimeter, you can do that, or you can put them in the chat, in the Zoom chat. I'm gonna stop the screen share for now.
Thank you very much. I do believe there will be some questions on the back of that, because I think all of us have lots of things going on in our minds and hearts right now. So I'll let you manage the questions and questioners as they come up here, people lifting their hands.
Sounds good. I did see a hand. Let me see. Not sure how to say this name, but Hyokung. I see your hand up if you want to.
Yes. Sorry, I came to this webinar a little late, but I see it's recorded, so I'll check it again from the very beginning. But the interest why I came to this webinar is because the topic, it said liturgy and trauma. And trauma can also diverge with those who are neurodivergent or not neurotypical. So for example, it can come concurrently with people who have hidden disabilities. I know people usually think of disabilities as something that's physical. But case in point, for example, when you're a registered student with accessibility, like majority of the students are, their disabilities are hidden.
Sure.
And mental distress, for example, under well, I know at U of T anyways, in other places it's considered a disability. So in the context of liturgy, I know liturgy is like, it's ritualistic, it has order, shape, and form. How can liturgy in the context of trauma-informed care, or the other way around, trauma-informed care lens, provide healing and accommodation for those who are neurodivergent and concurrently have trauma?
That's such a great question, and thank you for bringing that up. The reality that just like trauma can be hidden and unseen, so can things like disability. And it's not, we don't have to be in this judgment seat of this, of if I can't see it, it must not be real or something like that. We can just approach people as the creatures of mystery that we all are, whenever we're carrying, and worthy of dignity. So thank you for mentioning that. And I love this question about how can we ensure, first of all, well, there's kind of two issues here, is how do we make our worship spaces and practices ones that are accessible for people with various various needs and accessibility issues in general, which I'm coming from an Orthodox frame of reference where we still have so much work. In some ways, we have a lot of work to do in that area, and recognizing that people come to the liturgy with all different needs and all different ways of being able to participate in the liturgy. My friend Summer Kennard has written a great theology of disability that speaks to this question broadly, but particularly to contexts that are a bit more liturgy heavy, like the Orthodox Church. But the second issue you raise is like particularly people who may have disabilities and trauma experiences. And maybe some of those trauma experiences are around their disability, of people doubting or having to constantly explain themselves or constantly advocate for their needs in harsh conditions. I'm not sure that I have an answer, except to affirm that that's a huge need, and maybe it's one of the things that all of us here can have in mind and ask, bring to God in prayer, and consider in the context of our own communities, is how do we hold space for that particular facet of trauma and embodied personhood. And I think admitting first of all that most of our communities fall short, and we need wisdom in this area. I see a question in the chat, and then Father Deacon David, with respect to liturgy, how would you want space to be created or held in a worshiping community? i.e., how might prayers and reflections be trauma informed? There's so many ways, and there's so many. That's why I kind of put the creative bonus on you guys. But here, some things that come to my mind are, I think, first of all, beginning with ourselves, each of us beginning with ourselves, instead of asking, what does my church need to do better? And what does my bishop need to be more aware of? And what does my priest need to do a better job at? It's looking at ourselves and recognizing where maybe we have missed the mark in passing comment. That's the worst, is like just passing comments when we are talking about a news story or a particular issue, and we assume everyone at coffee hour, everyone in fellowship group is on the in group, and we all agree that this particular person had it coming or doesn't get it or whatever, and we make these flippant comments. My point is starting with ourselves and how we treat others, whether those directly before us or the people we talk about behind their back, and asking ourselves, what do we need to do to approach our neighbors with reverence and honoring the fact that they may be carrying things we have never even had to think about. With respect to, because we make up the liturgy, right? We are the participants in liturgy, and it has to begin with us. Actually in liturgy, I think rather than having a kind of one size fits all, like, first of all, I'm a big believer, the things that are one size fits all for me are like making sure there's clear like insurance and policies in place about who has access to children and what we need to be aware of in our worship community. But in terms of like how liturgy, how we can practice trauma-informed strategies in our worshiping communities, I think a lot of that also has to do with pastoral need and the fact that different communities are made up of different types of populations, and some of those populations may need different needs. And, so maybe thinking about the types of prayers that we include or the types of services that we have, and thinking about the people who are actually in our pews and what they need is a start. I'm not giving a very clear answer because I have too many thoughts running through my head. And after I get done giving the talk, my brain suddenly shuts off. So this is kind of not a good answer. But I think it's a question we should all think about in regards to our specific communities. I saw a question from Deacon David.
First, thank you very much for an excellent talk, for helping me think about things in a way maybe I have not thought about them before. And I really appreciated that you rooted everything in remembering, in anamnesis.
Yes.
And I could have two questions for you. One about that you could relate in some way the remembering or the anamnesis, which God also remembers, especially in our Orthodox liturgy, where we ask God to remember people and remember us over and over again. And how all of remembrance is tied in to God's economy, into God's plan of creation. And I'll just leave you with that question because my other question is probably too complex.
Yeah. I don't doubt that. Yes, I didn't even use the word anamnesis because that's a whole thing. But thank you for bringing that up. So for those folks who maybe aren't as familiar with this Greek term anamnesis, it's a Greek theological term for remembrance, but it's a particular kind of remembrance. It's almost like a sacred remembrance. And it's a way, it has a lot of layers, but it can kind of pertain to the fact that our being is rooted in God's memory of us. So when you read the Psalms and you hear language like, remember us, O Lord, it's not asking God to like keep, have a memory of us and don't forget about us. It's asking God to remember us in the sense of giving us life, because it's out of God's memory that we exist. It's out of God's being mindful of us and towards us, and towards our existence, that we live and move and have our being. I guess one of the thoughts that comes to mind, I don't see this really as necessarily a question that you've asked, just as a kind of point to comment on. And I guess one thing that I find so comforting about that is, for anyone who's been through trauma, the memories can be overwhelming, and not just in the degree of pain, but just the sheer number of them. Because sometimes what happens is your brain doesn't remember anything, and you kind of you can struggle with dissociation or like a literal loss of memory. I'm reading Prince Harry's memoir Spare, and he talks about how he basically had no memories of his mother, Princess Di, for most of his life, except for the memories surrounding death. And he had to work with a therapist to reawaken those memories. And now he can remember good things and like memories from his childhood. But this is very common. But another thing that can happen is your mind can become hypervigilant and remember everything down to these like vivid details. And it's just overwhelming to try and contain all that in your mind. But you almost feel like if you don't, you're betraying yourself somehow, or it's gonna come back and attack you in some other way or something. And just knowing that that even when I don't remember, God does. And God really is the bearer of all these memories. I'm just tending my little corner of the garden of things to remember. And when it's too much for me, I can offer that to God with everything else for a little while and let him hold those things. And I don't have to be the hyper-vigilant person who's on top of everything and remembering everything all the time.
We've got some more hands up here. I think Dan. Yeah.
This is sparking back to the question about how liturgy can be healing to trauma. And that's I'm a spiritual care provider in acute and critical care hospital. And I think one of the things that liturgy does is it holds space for that idea of pendulation, which is like when you're just talking about when somebody starts to recount their trauma, it can be overwhelming very quickly because we go from this place of safety to this place of survival and threat and fear and anxiety very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so what I find liturgy does is allows us to safely and gently and slowly go into that trauma so that we can actually begin to heal it rather than be re-traumatized by revisiting it. And I actually think that it's the most powerful part about that is that pace, the way that ritual, whether it be in community or whether it be Christian or mindfulness meditation or any other form of spiritual liturgy, gives us space to remind our nervous systems and our bodies and our memories that they are safe and calm and held in something greater than our trauma. Yeah, so thank you for whoever asked that question. Thank you. It brought back a lot of powerful moments that I've shared with some very traumatized patients and myself.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I wanted to comment, if I may, that like one thing I've been thinking about is I've been rereading Father Alexander Schmemann's Introduction to Liturgical Theology, where he talks about I think it's him that was talking about this in that book, but how liturgy reactualizes the past. So when we are liturgizing the events of Christ's life, we believe that they are made present. And it's something that's similar in a way similar to what trauma does sometimes, when we, like what you're saying, Dan, about people who disclose a trauma experience. When they talk about it, it becomes present for them. They might even be feeling physical sensations that they felt at that time. And it's kind of a spectrum, but for some people, it may be almost indistinguishable from the past event. And they may really feel that the past is present. And it takes work to help them navigate that. But liturgy also provides us a model for bringing the past into the present in a way that's safe. It doesn't tell us, no, the past is this other thing, the present is one thing, it's all compartmentalized. It reminds us that we can safely bring the past into the present in order to make sense of it and heal. They don't have to the past doesn't have to tyrannize us in the present. That's one thing that came to mind this year. Okay. I see another hand, Cameron. You want to share?
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Nicole. Very much like your stuff so far. I'll be quick because my question comment is very similar to the last gentleman. I'm about a quarter way and just talking about in the context of souls with PTSD, how the opposite of war is liturgy. And he was making the point, which is I found really interesting and very new to me because I'm not familiar with these things. How he wasn't using it in the Orthodox context liturgy, but more as the last person who spoke was talking about just refocusing things, the ritual participation in things that are beautiful in your life to heal trauma. Now, my question would be, I think that's very much in line with what you're saying today, and how would that affect your praxis when you're talking to your clients?
Yeah. Cameron, your sound was cutting out quite a bit, so unfortunately, I didn't hear the work that you cited.
Sorry, obviously I'm in my car, so I don't have great
That's
reception.
okay.
It was Ethics of Beauty by Timothy Pettis.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking you might be talking about, yeah. And so you're talking about the appreciation of beauty and noticing beauty around us, including that which we find in the liturgy as one mode of healing. If I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, and so sorry, it was very similar to the last person's comment. And I was just wondering how that affects your praxis with your clients.
Well, one thing that this has been an interesting exercise that I sometimes do with clients is I call it a glimmer hunt. And this is part of a much larger methodology that's informed by polyvagal theory, but basically, to shorten it for the purpose of this question, a lot of times people focus on triggers, and when they're trying to heal or move forward in their lives, they're trying to identify all the things that trigger them so they can stay clear of those things and lead like a full life towards everything else. But that can become sort of can actually be very limiting over time, because when we avoid triggers, they tend to get bigger and more powerful, because it's like we're teaching our bodies and our minds that the triggers really are dangerous and we need to stay away from them. And so what one of the things polyvagal theory tries to do is it waits to focus on the triggers, it waits to examine triggers, and starts instead with what are called glimmers. And glimmers are the opposite of triggers. A glimmer is anything in the world around us or the world within us that creates a micro moment of where we feel safe or connected to the world around us. And so it may be something as subtle as, like, I have an empty thing of espresso here, and every now and then I get a whiff of the caffeine smell from the empty glass. And that gives me a feeling of a very subtle micro moment feeling of safety and connection. And the more we tune into those moments, it might be a flower, it might be a work of art, it might be a smile from somebody that we love. When we learn to tune into those and be aware of those, they grow, and our capacity to experience them grows. Our capacity to experience safety grows. And the liturgy is definitely a source where people might experience some of these glimmers and be able to build capacity to experience safety and connection through that. That was just some random thing that came to mind in response to your thought. I see something else here in chat. Someone says this is probably different for everyone, but how can we balance holding, understanding, and contemplating trauma while also forgiving ourselves and letting go of that trauma? Yeah, that's a big thing. There's no easy answer there, but forgiving ourselves and also learning again to trust ourselves and our own perceptions is a huge part of healing. One thing that I sometimes say, and I don't know if this is helpful, but Christ says to love our neighbors as ourselves. And many of us, I think it's less of a struggle to understand the need to love our neighbors and the fact that our neighbors are worthy of love. How we go about that might be harder if they really annoy us or they really hurt us or whatever. But this mandate to love our neighbors as ourselves, grammatically, if we switch the clauses around, it's actually a kind of invitation in disguise to love ourselves as our neighbor, to relate to ourselves as our neighbors, as people that we can learn to exercise love towards. And sometimes looking at it that way gives us permission to take new steps in that direction, that we might be less willing to take if we see ourselves as unworthy to begin with. Thank you for sharing your experience. As far as, and I don't think it's just priests who sometimes dismiss the reality of trauma or the severity of it or anything. I think anyone is prone to that, although when people are in positions of spiritual authority, the damage they can do is it is more than just to average Joe who doesn't think trauma is real. I don't have any answers for that, and I think it's case by case. There's all sorts of reasons why a person may be motivated or prone to deny the reality of trauma. Maybe they have things in their own life that facing would be too difficult, and so they want to take even the existence of trauma off the table for everyone. There's all sorts of reasons. I think we have to be, those of us who maybe are in positions where we're able to influence things, have to do what we can to raise awareness and provide education around some of these things. But on the level of just being an ordinary parishioner and layperson, we have to recognize that if we're a trauma survivor, being in a parish with a priest who doesn't think what we've experienced is real, or worse, thinks it's may hold certain views where treating women in a certain way is advisable or condonable or something, that may not be a safe environment for us. It's not a safe environment for us, and we owe it to ourselves to do what we need to do to find a spiritual environment that's safer, and that's where somebody is wise and can be the shepherd that they're supposed to be in the New Testament and in the mandates of the church.
Yeah, I guess it's just like I know you said you don't have the answers for it, but like I think some of us, and I'm not Orthodox, but like our calling in particular to ministry is because of our own lived experiences as survivors.
Sure.
And Henry Nouwen calls it wounded healers.
Yeah.
But like, I think it's like my question is around the context of like those people who hold authority and present themselves as experts of trauma or are, you know, like have those acronyms that present themselves as experts. What if they also inflict trauma?
That happens every
And
day. Yeah, that happens every day.
and like, how do you, like, I know the biblical model is to go to the person directly and let them know, and then if they don't listen, then you go get someone else. But it's not that easy. And so, first of all, how do you communicate in a way where A, you're safe, B, you let the person know that they are actually doing the opposite of what they claim to be experts of and are in fact doing the opposite and inflicting trauma? And C, how do you communicate accountability and integrity in the context of Christian reconciliation and healing?
Great questions. And it's difficult. One reason this is difficult to answer is because this can take so many different forms. And the systems of accountability are so different between different professions and licensed boards and even between different churches and denominations. The kinds of accountability measures look different and chain of command is different. What I do, so I can't give a one size fits all of how you confront somebody or challenge somebody who might be doing harm, and also the kinds of harm that is being done. There's some of it is intentional, some of it is unintentional, and there's, it's really not something you can give a one size fits all of how you deal with this. But one thing I can say about this, you raise the model of that's often presented from the New Testament of when someone is caught up in sin, you first confront them one-on-one, and then if that doesn't work, you bring multiple people, etc. That, that has a contextual basis that I'm not sure extends, that it has a specific context. And there are many times where someone is committing harm that's of a nature where it's not safe to confront them. And the best thing you can do is simply protect yourself from that person and prevent that person from having access. Some people cannot be confronted safely, particularly by victims. And I say that because I think we should be aware of it, and it's not always our job to make sure the perpetrator understands the evil of what they've done, because depending on the person, you can explain things till you're blue in the face, and unless they're willing to face the truth of what they've done and repent of it, they're not going to see it or want to see it. So we have to ask God for wisdom, and we have to have people in our lives that we can trust when we come into situations like this, and people that can help us find resources when accountability is needed. And so that we don't have to face these questions alone or advocate for ourselves alone.
I think we'll draw a line under things here, but thank you all for your participation and for the really stimulating questions there at the end. I think it shows that people are indeed carrying things away from our time together and things that they'll continue to ponder on. So thanks again, Dr. Nicole Roccas, for a wonderful session together. I think you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of work to do too, as we think about our own context and ministry and liturgical spaces where we can hold people and even ourselves, obviously, in a place of healing, in a place of transformation towards the goodness of God's fullness and creation and intentions for creation. So thank you very much. Thank you all for your attendance today, and I wish you all well. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks for having me. And I did want to mention that in that resources sheet, there's all different ways you can connect with me if you so are inclined or have more questions or comments.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, bye now.